A former Catholic involved in illegal immigration and who considers Jesus the greatest revolutionary of all time is a leading voice at the Synod. Join us with the latest from the Eternal City. Church Militant's Rome correspondent, Dr. Jules Gomes. Jules, talk to us about an angry activist who featured prominently at yesterday's Synod press briefing.
Brad, Luca Casarini, a 52-year-old Italian pro-immigration activist, is one of the most controversial figures in Italy. And yet he says he was surprised that he has been invited to the Synod of Bishops. Why? Because Pope Francis appreciates what he's doing to bring in migrants by the truckload.
Now, Casarini has had many run-ins with the law over the years. He describes himself as an angry activist. Can you tell us more about him and his past?
Well, he's been arrested a couple of times. He was placed under house arrest, I think, for a month in 2016. He's constantly, at loggerheads with the law. And the reason is because of his organization, the NGO Mediterranea Saving Humans, where these ships go. And they say, of course, they are saving people who are drowning. But people who are keeping a close watch on the uncontrolled immigration hitting the shores of Italy say that these people are acting as a taxi service, often funded by Germany, by the way. And Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has even tried to take control of these taxi ships that are literally helping immigrants, illegal immigrants to come ashore. And now the accusations against people like Luca Casarini are that they are actually human trafficking enablers. So what we have at the Synod, as a personal friend and invitee of Pope Francis, is a major enabler, a major player in this game of enabling human trafficking. Brad, I must tell you, I have been talking to a number of these illegal immigrants. Almost all of them are young Muslim men. And one of them told me that he paid 8,000 euros to be trafficked from Afghanistan to Italy. And he told me that, when I expressed shock, I said, how did you get this money? He said, wait, a friend of mine, this was 3 years ago, he said, a friend of mine is now paying human traffickers $7,000 just to be transported from Afghanistan across the border into Iran. And such major crimes are being supported by inviting these enablers to the Synod.
Yes, men of military age, Muslim background, and that, what could go wrong there? Seems like Casarini would be a polarizing figure at the Synod discussions, basically an anti-Catholic from the time he was 12, angry activist and revolutionary. He himself says Jesus was the greatest of revolutionaries. What's the Italian media saying about Casarini, and is the Synod experiencing polarization?
Well, the word polarization is very interesting. Because yesterday, Paolo Ruffini, the prefect of the Dicastery for Communication, who was moderating the press conference, said that, there is no polarization. And the Italian media immediately responded and said, come on, you've got to be kidding, because you've invited one of the most polarizing figures to address this press conference, and you're telling us that there is no polarization. Now, to be fair, there isn't polarization at the synod on synodality, because most of the characters, particularly the loudmouths who have been invited, are people who are supporting Pope Francis's agenda. And we know one of the most important items on the agenda, I mean, you can see it from the sculpture that continues to dominate, a part of St. Peter's Piazza, is, of course, unbridled, uncontrolled immigration, without any rhyme or reason for it. So this was, and you also talked, Brad, about his being a Catholic, and that is another question he was asked. And he said, well, I was brought up a Catholic, but I don't consider myself a Catholic. I consider myself a Christian. But then he did not define what he meant by Christian, basically, being good to people and doing what Jesus did, which is generally construed as acts of social justice, quote unquote. So he said, I don't go for confession, I don't go for mass. And he was asked, does the silence and prayer make him feel uncomfortable? And he said, well, I can take the silence, but he did admit a sense of disquiet at the kind of more explicit spiritual activity that goes on at the Synod. But he says, the whole point of it is to be welcoming, include everybody. And Brad, we've talked about homosexuals, polygamous couples, women who want ordination in the Catholic Church. And if all this happens, we even talked about voodoo yesterday. So if all this can be welcomed, obviously, illegal immigrants must be made to feel welcome as well by the church.
Now, with guys like Casarini at the Synod, not to mention folks like Father James Martin, who we covered yesterday, and others, the rumor seems even more problematic. That Pope Francis could possibly give the Synod some form of magisterial authority instead of leaving it as it is, simply a tool for consultation. Is anyone concerned about the status of the Synod being changed?
Cardinal Juan Sandoval Iniguez was asked that very question. Now, Iniguez is a retired cardinal. He's one of the 5 signatories of the Dubia to Pope Francis. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. And he said, of course, that at the moment, given the status of canon law, this is not a magisterial body because it's not a synod of bishops, even though it is called a synod of bishops. Now, again, this adds considerably to the confusion, Brad. If it's being called a synod of bishops, but it is not entirely a synod of bishops, and a synod of bishops has magisterial authority, according to Cardinal Iniguez. What status does this have? And Cardinal Iniguez says, with a flick of his pen, Pope Francis can decide that this body has magisterial status. And from what I'm hearing of the discussions, the participants are being assured that they're not wasting their time because this is not a talking shop. They are being told this is a synod of bishops and their decisions are going to be not just taken very seriously, but their decisions are going to be final because Pope Francis wants to hear the voice of the people. And, as the old saying goes, vox populi, vox Dei, even though it may be true or false. And Pope Francis certainly has given the impression that he believes this axiom.
Now, dovetailing off of our show yesterday, Jules, we saw certain questions being distributed to certain tables. For instance, Father James Martin's table just happened to be given the question to address the inclusion of Catholics who have LGBT attachments. So it seems not everyone at the Synod is discussing everything equally. Casarini is talking about open borders. Father James Martin is talking about opening the sacraments up to LGBT, those who live an LGBT lifestyle, presumably, receiving Holy Communion as if the Ten Commandments doesn't apply to them. But the point is, the Synod doesn't seem to, in practice here, really be a group discussion where everyone weighs in on each of these issues. It seems to be a series of small closed-loop discussions at specific tables, if only a few people on each topic. Your thoughts on that?
You're right, Brad. First of all, concerning the methodology that is being followed, a unique, innovative methodology, if I may say so, because there are 35 tables, as we've pointed out earlier, and in earlier synods, previous synods, what would happen is, yes, people would be participants, would be divided according to language groups, but not according to thematic groups. Now it's both language groups and thematic groups. Moreover, participants have been given a choice of what groups they would like to participate in. So if you get a list and you have to tick off your list, and if you, like Father James Martin, are an LGBTQ activist, you will tick that off and you will automatically be transferred to that particular table to be part of that discussion group. But an African cardinal, for that matter, who is not particularly concerned about LGBT, whatever, but is more interested in, the persecution of Christians by Islamic militants, will tick that box off. And so these two groups will be, like East is East and West is West, and there the twain shall meet. What will happen is, yes, when he was asked about this, Cardinal Joseph Tobin yesterday said, we haven't particularly marched people into, different groups. They've been left free to choose for themselves, and they can always stand up and, raise their voices on any discussion topic they choose to. But Brad, for anybody who's taken part in either small group or large group discussions knows how group dynamics work. And, people who are timid, but who nevertheless have godly and strong views on homosexuality, for example, are not going to dare to stand up before an audience hall of 535 people and voice their opinions, particularly if they know that a large majority of these participants already, stand for full inclusion of homosexuals, whatever that means. So that the methodology is quite worrying. For example, table B 1.2 is going to be discussing the inclusion of sexually marginalized groups like the LGBT people, polygamous couples, etc. You can't really call them a couple, can you? And then group B 2.3 will be discussing women's inclusion. So, is it possible for us to have women deacons and priests, etc., etc.? And therefore, when you take these reports up, it's not going to be the consensus of the entire Synod, but it is going to be the viewpoints of particular tables who have been discussing these issues.
And even at that particular table, Father James Martin may have more sway at that table than some of the other people I saw at that same table that he was at. Didn't seem to be real live wires there, so it's going to be more of his take on that topic rather than the whole Synod take as it's being presented.
And probably there won't be any dissenting voice at that table, because all those people at that table will have ticked the box saying that, yes, I want to be part of this group. And presumably, we can assume that they will all be people who wish to push the same agenda.
Yeah, that's something really very, very important to understand, that dynamic that's going on at the Synod right now and how it's actually being presented as a Synod of bishops and a group discussion on all these topics, free discussion for everybody, and yet it's being parceled down into just specific groups talking about specific things. One final question, Jules. What's the role, we hear about the inclusion of women and everything. What's the role of women at the Synod? Are they getting an equal role in the synodal process there?
Brad, this is so funny, and it's proved to be hugely embarrassing for the organizers, because they have now voted on the composition of two important groups. One is the synthesis group, people who will actually be putting the reports together, these discussion reports, and then the information group. But guess what? The people who are selected on these groups are, almost all, sorry, not almost all, they were all men. There wasn't a single woman either elected to the synthesis group or to the information group, and the Pope had to nominate a woman to the synthesis group and a woman to the information group. So that's quite telling as to where the where this is going, because again, from what I hear, it's people vote, the old boys club voting for their own chums they would like to see in these important groups.
Well, at least the Pope stood up and balanced things out a little bit anyway. So, well, the bottom line for this all, synods come and go. Popes and their policies come and go. A future pope, for instance, could immediately reverse the course of previous papal policies. But God's ultimately in charge of the future of the Catholic Church, a God who never changes. So learn the unchanging truths of our Catholic faith. Live that Catholic faith to its fullest. And pray for your spiritual leaders, our spiritual leaders, as we are all called to do. Jules, thank you so much for your report today and helping us get our head wrapped around all this.
Thank you, Brad.
Thanks again for watching today's episode of Rome Dispatch. This show is brought to you by donors like Real Estate for Life. If you're looking to buy or sell a home and want to support our mission, visit realestateforlife.org. Again, that's realestateforlife.org. Be sure to tell them Church Militant sent you. God bless.